Welcome to today's public program. I'm excited to be here as part of the 4th annual 9/11 Memorial and Museum Summit on Security. My name is Annmarie Hordern. I'm Washington correspondent for Bloomberg Television. And I first want to introduce our first guest of the event. Alejandro Mayorkas was sworn in as Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security by President Biden on February 2nd, 2021. Mayorkas is the first Latino and immigrant confirmed to serve as Secretary of Homeland Security. He has led a distinguished 30-year career as a law enforcement official and a nationally recognized lawyer in the private sector. Mayorkas served as the Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security from 2013 to 2016 and as the Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services from 2009 to 2013. During his tenure at DHS, he led the development and implementation of DACA, negotiated cybersecurity and homeland security agreements with foreign governments, led the department's response to Ebola and Zika, helped build and administer the Blue Campaign to combat human trafficking, and developed an emergency relief program for orphaned youth following the tragic January 2010 earthquake in Haiti. Mayorkas also created the Fraud Detection and National Security Directorate to better ensure the integrity of the legal immigration system. Mayorkas began his government service in the Department of Justice, where he served as an assistant United States attorney in the Central District of California, specializing in the prosecution of white-collar crime. After nearly 9 years as a federal prosecutor, he became the youngest U.S. attorney in the nation, overseeing prosecutions of national significance, including the investigation and prosecution of financial fraud, violations on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, public corruption, violent crime, cybercrime, environmental crime, international money laundering, and securities fraud. Mayorkas received his bachelor's degree with distinction from the University of California at Berkeley and a law degree from Loyola Law School. And before we begin, just a quick couple of housekeeping notes. You can access live captioning for this program by clicking the link directly below the video player. And if you have a question for Secretary Mayorkas, I know a lot of you already do on Twitter, click on the chat bubble on the bottom right hand of the screen. And with all of that, let's begin. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be a part of it.
Yes, me too. We just marked 20 years on from 9/11, something personal for me as a New Yorker. You, of course, were there at the anniversary commemoration with President Biden nearly 2 months ago. The Department of Homeland Security was born out of that tragic day. We just went through this massive CV of yours, these expertise. Knowing what you know, what do you think the department has learned since 9/11?
I think that we have seen the threat evolve over the years, over the 20 years. I've spoken about this before, where back in the aftermath of the tragic day of 9/11, really the terrorist threat that we were most focused on was the foreign terrorist, the foreign fighter who sought to enter the United States and do us harm here. We saw that evolve. That threat never really disappeared, but we saw the most prominent threat become the homegrown violent extremist, the individual already resident in the United States who was perhaps motivated by a foreign terrorist organization's ideology to do harm. And now we've seen over the last few years, the most prominent threat become the domestic violent extremist, the individual prone to violence by reason of an ideology of hate or false narratives propagated on social media. We've seen the threat evolve, and yet we have not seen its prior iterations disappear. And I think what we've learned, quite frankly, is something that we knew right from the get-go, and it's only been reinforced. And that is that our work in the Department of Homeland Security requires vigilance throughout the day, every day. And our greatest asset are in fact our people, the people in the department.
When you look at the domestic threats versus foreign, how much harder is it to act upon them, given that many of these are U.S. citizens and you cannot always infringe on constitutional rights?
So we are very well positioned to draw a distinction between illegal conduct and that which is actually protected under the law. We have a statutorily created Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties and a statutorily created Office of Privacy. And our chief civil rights, civil liberties official, our chief privacy officer are at the leadership table in all that we do. We are not interested in the suppression of free speech, sometimes however odious that speech might be. What we are focused on from a Homeland Security perspective is the connection between that speech and acts of violence, the antisocial behavior. That is what we are focused on, and I think we do it quite adeptly.
We also, of course, are just a few months out from the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan. And General Milley had said that it's a real possibility we could see a reconstitution of al-Qaeda and ISIS in Afghanistan. Are you worried about the lack of intelligence from potential future foreign threats, given the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan?
So I think it's quite clear that our aperture of information gathering from in Afghanistan has diminished. We have other tools at our disposal, and we have an intelligence and information gathering architecture that I think is unparalleled in the world. But it does, of course, cause us concern, and we're very focused on our other tools.
And when Homeland Security Department was born, it was really about that foreign threat. And I know the focus now is domestic, but you still have to keep an eye on the foreign. I know you look after a very wide swath of different departments under your in your agency. How hard is it to address both of these at once, the domestic and foreign threats at the same time?
I think it's a challenge. I think we meet that challenge. And those aren't the only challenges that we confront across the Department of Homeland Security. This returns to my basic, most fundamental point, which is we do what we are able to do because of the extraordinary dedication and skill of our personnel. I will say that the situation in Afghanistan certainly has increased the prominence of the foreign terrorist threat. And it's something that we give a renewed focus to, but our vigilance has never waned.
When you say renewed focus too, we don't have assets on the ground. Can you just give us a little bit of insight of what that looks like?
So we have social media platforms that we are able to learn from. We leverage the private sector. We leverage think tanks, academic institutions that study and analyze trends on social media. We have an Office of Intelligence and Analysis here that understands the legal parameters and the policy parameters of our information and intelligence gathering capabilities. And we use these tools within those parameters to learn as much as we can about the threat. And remember that we're not alone in this effort because we have extraordinary partnerships around the world.
And you think the U.S. is in a good place in terms of the exit of Afghanistan? You feel confident that even if there was a reconstitution, the U.S. would be able to detect that threat?
I think we can, and we have, it's not just the Department of Homeland Security that is involved in that enterprise, of course. We have other departments and agencies across the federal enterprise, and we work very closely, as I mentioned earlier, with our allies around the world.
So the threats have certainly changed 20 years on. They've also become a little bit more high tech, and I'm thinking of cybersecurity. And last year, the U.S. government was actually hacked, and it went undetected until a private company had actually found it. What happened since the wake of that undetected for a few months attack?
So the attack to which you refer was one of the most sophisticated attacks that we have observed and that our allies have observed, and you are correct in describing it as one that occupied a great deal of time, and it was by reason of a private sector company that it was discovered. What that has done is only enhanced and elevated the federal government's focus on the cybersecurity challenges, and has only strengthened our commitment to partnership in addressing that challenge. That is a challenge that we in the government cannot meet alone. It requires a public-private partnership, and we in the Department of Homeland Security, through our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, are very focused on that public-private partnership and the sharing of information to elevate the cyber hygiene of our country as a whole.
It's a fine line, though, right? Sharing between the private sector at the same time, almost being a regulator at times. Can you take us a little bit into what that relationship looks like?
So let me first share with you the foundation of information sharing. It is built on the following premise: that if company A suffers a hack, a cyber intrusion, and it shares that information with us within the government, then we can take that information, anonymize it, and disseminate it throughout industry so that other companies that might be vulnerable to that very same type of hack, that same methodology, could actually better defend themselves against it. And if everybody shares information with us and we accordingly disseminate it, we raise the bar, the defense bar, we raise the cyber hygiene. We have built a voluntary framework for that information sharing. CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is the quarterback in the federal government of that partnership. We have legislation pending now that actually speaks to a mandatory information sharing environment and architecture, and we'll see where that legislation goes. But that is obviously, if that legislation passes, it will build a compulsory framework that will further enhance the information sharing that we currently engage in.
When you talk about CISA, if I could just get a little bit more of a sense of that balance, because I know it's not intended to be a regulator, but some private companies do feel like sometimes it is. How do you strike that balance when working with the private sector? So
what CISA is focused on is being a partner in assisting a company, assisting the private industry in understanding the threat vectors, being able to prevent them from succeeding. If in fact a hack or an intrusion does occur, understanding the intrusion, mitigating the harm, and then building resilience for the future. CISA is not an entity that is focused on accountability and liability, but rather partnership and strengthening. So that is, I think, what CISA's greatest asset is.
Working with the private sector was something outlined by President Biden in his executive order. There also was other initiatives like modernizing cyber in the federal government. Do you have progress on some of those priorities he set out in the executive order?
Oh, we most certainly do. And CISA, for example, has built the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, the JCDC, which is really advancing the information sharing extraordinarily under Jen Easterly's leadership. And we work, of course, very closely with the National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis, and Ann Neuberger in the National Security Council. So we're really bringing a far greater level of cohesion across the federal enterprise than I think has ever been brought before. The federal government is advancing. We, through CISA, just issued a binding operational directive to drive better cyber response to known vulnerabilities. across the federal government. But I will be very candid with you, Annmarie, we are not where we need to be, but we are driving to get there.
So how do we get where we need to be?
Enduring commitment, not taking our foot off the accelerator, public-private partnership, sharing information across the federal government and from the federal government with the private sector and on a reciprocal basis.
What about the technology? Is the U.S. up to scratch in terms of the technology needed to thwart some of these cyber security threats?
We are. The issue is, and this is a very well-worn maxim in the cybersecurity domain, that one is only as strong as one's weakest link. Because of our interconnectedness, if in fact a link is weak, then we are all made vulnerable by it. So we're very focused. Of course, the most sophisticated, the best resourced have the technology, but there are others who don't. And we have dedicated funds to grant programs to state and local communities, tribal and territorial officials, to really equip and empower them to invest in technology, to strengthen their cyber resilience. And I think we need to do more of that, and we are committed to it.
There's also another recent hack, which was, of course, Colonial Pipeline. And because of what the hackers were able to get information-wise, the company had to actually idle the largest U.S. fuel pipeline. So this is directly attacking U.S. infrastructure. And we know that this was based off of a group in Russia. If the United States is aware that these are Russian hackers, why is the U.S. not directly hitting Russia back?
Well, I think your question supposes a situation that might not, in fact, be the case. Let me say a few things. Number one, in response to the Colonial Pipeline attack, TSA, the Transportation Security Administration, which oversees the pipelines, has issued 2 security directives that drive greater cybersecurity in the pipeline industry. Number one. Number two, we have the experts group between Russia and the United States to work on cybersecurity. President Biden has spoken quite directly and powerfully to the fact that he expects countries, including Russia, who host cyber criminals within their boundaries, to address that cyber crime originating within their geographies. And we have employed and will continue to employ the tools that we have, whether it be public attribution, whether it be the imposition of sanctions, whether it be the indictment and apprehension of individual wrongdoers, to bring force to bear to drive lawful behavior.
President Biden had said about those groups that President Vladimir Putin knows who they are and where they are. Do you believe that these Russian hacking groups are directed by the Kremlin or authorized?
So I think each case must stand on the facts of that particular case. I don't think that a sweeping statement would actually be accurate. You know, the Department of Justice just yesterday, I think, spoke very powerfully with respect to some of the successes it has achieved in terms of driving accountability. And I think what President Biden also has said, because we have received commitments in words, it's actions that speak.
When it comes to the work done with your department and Colonial, because of that hack, has there now been other companies that you are fortifying in the wake of that?
Most certainly. I think what Colonial Pipeline did was that it caught the public's attention because the public reaction to it was a concern about access to fuel. How are we going to fill the tanks of our cars? How are we going to how is this going to impact our day-to-day lives? And I think it brought the cybersecurity threat inside the home in a way that the American public best understood. And so we have indeed used that threat vector as a way of engaging with the public more effectively. And we have seen a more receptive public. And by that, I mean not just the consumer, but also the business community. And we've worked very closely for years now with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on focusing not only on the sophisticated, but the small businesses that might not necessarily be so well aware of the threat and understand what they can do, some of the simple blocking and tackling that can make a difference in strengthening their defenses.
Secretary Mayorkas, you bring up a really good point about Colonial, what is so different than other hacks. Other hacks, you might get an email saying your email was part of a list that was taken from XYZ company, data company, credit card company. But Colonial, it affected people, their potential everyday lives into their homes. Do you think that gives a boost to your department to maybe take more aggressive action when it comes to cybersecurity?
We have used it, and we have used it as a boost. And this is, of course, it requires a very sophisticated defense to protect against a very sophisticated threat. In terms of the American public, sometimes the very simple things, the easily accessible things make a big difference. A strong password, changing a strong password, not clicking on a link that one does not recognize, either at home or in one's place of business.
I'm guilty of all of these.
but it's not that difficult, and it really is impactful.
As the department, we're 23 minutes in, and we've outlined three distinct threats to the United States: domestic, foreign, and then this almost unknown cybersecurity, right? We can't see it until it actually happens. It's this blind spot. Where do you think more of like Congress, if they're going to put new money towards cybersecurity, where should it go?
Oh, I would advocate, and I have advocated, it should go to all of the above. These are the threats that we face. This is what we in the Department of Homeland Security do. These are the challenges we confront, and there are more than these. And I think you're very correct in identifying the foreign threat, the domestic threat, and then the one that doesn't really know geography, which is the cyber threat that knows no boundaries. I would say all of the above and more.
And just another question on cyber. We know that Colonial ended up having to pay. Does your department work with companies when they come into these moments where they're pretty much in a very difficult position because they want to move on as quickly as possible? And if that means paying up to these hackers, they might just do that. But that potentially might be in the interest of you or the United States.
And it might not be in the interest of the company itself, and certainly other companies in its space or more broadly. Our position is that ransoms should not be paid. That is the government's position. At the same time, to your point, we recognize the difficulty that a victimized company confronts when, in fact, its well-being is held hostage to the ransomware hackers. So we are mindful of that. It continues to be our position that we cannot make ransomware profitable by paying the ransomware, but we understand, or I should say, and we understand the difficulties. And that's why what we do is we encourage a victimized company to actually reach out to us, because we can assist in navigating through that challenge successfully without paying the ransom.
We mentioned Russia briefly. I wanted to just get your take on what is going on in China. Recently, hypersonic missiles we learned were being tested. How important has China become on your priority list when you're scouring foreign threats?
I think very much so. And this is not specific to the cyber environment. You know, there's a real thought leader in the cyber space, Dmitry Alperovich. And Dmitry said, when speaking of the cyber threat vectors from Russia, from China, other countries, he said, you know, we don't have a cyber problem. We have a Russia problem. We have a China problem. We have an Iran problem. The cyber threat has to be viewed in the context of the bilateral relationship and the broader geopolitical landscape. And I think that was a very astute observation that I have repeated at every opportunity, because it's true. China is a very significant issue for our Department of Homeland Security and for the United States of America.
What kind of measures is your department taking when it comes to China specifically?
Well, let me give you one that I have been quite focused on, and we have done extraordinary work that has been recognized across the nation. We in the Department of Homeland Security fight forced labor wherever it may exist in the world, and we have a tool in U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the withhold release order, which provides under the law that we have the ability to withhold from importation goods that are manufactured or contain in whole or in part materials that are produced through forced labor. And we have, in fact, withheld goods from China for that very reason. That's just one small example of what we've done. The United States Coast Guard has assisted other countries in fighting illegal fishing in their waters that has threatened their economic security. We work with partners around the world to address the threat that China might pose through its illegal acts.
When you mentioned China, Russia, and Iran, are those the top three countries in terms of potential threats emanating from that your department's focused on?
I think they are.
Anything else in terms of China you can let us in on what the department potentially is moving resources to?
Oh, so we, obviously we are joined with other law enforcement and intelligence partners to address efforts to steal America's intellectual property. That is one of the things that we have seen China exploit in the cybersecurity domain, not only to serve its counterintelligence efforts, but to steal our intellectual property and to unfairly give it an economic advantage. That's just another example that comes immediately to mind. But the threats are varied, and our efforts are accordingly.
We're about 30 minutes in, Secretary. So I just want to remind our viewers that if they want to get involved in the conversation, that there is a chat bubble in the bottom right-hand side of the screen, because I'm sure people have a lot of questions for you, and we have a lot of time with you. We're lucky for that. I want to move on to a little bit more of concerns at home when it comes to migration and immigration. I want to start with what happened this week, which is the U.S. basically back to business, welcoming tourists and businesses across our borders. And pre 9/11, of course, traveling was so much different. Now entering the United States, there is hefty security. When you knew that we were going to be back to business this week, right? And I know a lot of my European friends couldn't wait for the date. What was the preparations like? Because I imagine you knew it was going to be a mass influx of travelers.
So we've been preparing for this. Should the arc of the pandemic allow us to really reopen international travel, reopen the land ports of entry. we've been watching the science, watching the data as part of an all of government effort led by Jeff Zients, who's really just extraordinary. So we've been hoping for this, and frankly, accompanying our hope with action in driving an effort to vaccinate the American public, and so much more. So we've been modeling this with our staff. We've been developing operational plans so that we could, in fact, be ready for the reopening of international travel, and in fact, we are. In the land environment, what we have communicated is that people should, in fact, at the ports of entry, expect wait times that are longer than usual, because in fact, there is such pent-up demand for that travel. In the air environment, what our collective experience has shown is that actually we can normalize those wait times in a matter of days. And so we work with the private sector, the airports, the airlines, to achieve that. Our constraint in the land ports of entry is that our land ports of entry are not modernized sufficiently. And so we're quite constrained by their very architecture and other limitations of history, which, if I may say, why the infrastructure bill is so momentous, because it does dedicate funds to the modernization of land ports of entry, which has been so long in coming and so welcome in now receiving under President Biden's leadership.
Yeah, can you talk a little about some of that potential changes we could see at our land entries because of the hard infrastructure bill?
Oh, so we have been working on advancing our technological footprint in the land ports of entry. But those of us who have studied the land ports of entry for many years understand how lane formulation is so limiting. One goes to the Peace Bridge in upstate New York, the border of the United States and Canada. The one sees the advances we've made, but nevertheless the historic limitations that remain. So what can we do in terms of lane development, better use, investment in and better use of technology, trusted programs, facilities for secondary inspection, the foot traffic that goes through the ports of entry, and how we can better really facilitate that. I think that the opportunities are endless, and now we're resourced in an unprecedented way.
I should say, from personal experience, the mobile passport changed my life when I was living abroad and coming back and forth to JFK. That got rid of so many lines for me.
And that mobile passport, I want to, if I can, tip the hand to U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Office of Field Operations. That was an innovation that they really led, and many more will be coming.
Okay, that's good. I'm sure a lot of travelers are excited about that, especially coming out of the pandemic and being vaccinated. But to your point on those land borders, how can you make sure at the same time, because there is such a mass of people, a mass influx at once, that it is also making sure that all security measures are being taken appropriately?
So this is what we do, whether it's CBP, whether it's TSA, our personnel understand that trade and travel, migration are engines of prosperity. At the same time, on a risk-based platform, we have to make sure that that trade, that travel, that legal migration is achieved while protecting the safety and security of the American public. That's why we have such expertise in the eyes and ears of our personnel. We deploy our technology so ably. We have our Office of Science and Technology looking at the cutting edge developments in technology. So we're always advancing. We're meeting our mission to facilitate lawful trade and travel, and meeting our mission to protect the American people.
On the southern border, as we have these legal crossings really opening up, how has the migration situation specifically impacted that trade and travel on the southern border?
Well, we have quite a number, Annmarie, we have quite a number of ports of entry along the southern border. And what we have sought to do, the trade and travel, the legal migration will, of course, come through those ports of entry. What we have sought to do is try to drive irregular migration through safe, orderly, and humane pathways to arrive between the ports of entry, to place one's life, well-being, and one's money in the hands of smugglers is not the right thing to do. The border is not open to that. And so what we have been doing is rebuilding an asylum system that the prior administration dismantled in its entirety. We are building alternative pathways, such as the Central American Miners Program, such as the Migrant Resource Center in Guatemala, to provide avenues for people to make their claims for relief under United States law without having to take the perilous journey and seeking to enter this country illegally.
But the issue is, and of course you know this, is the past 8 months, the border crossings have been at an all-time high. Do you think that shows that the U.S. needs a tougher stance? Oh,
I think it shows a number of things, if I may. First and foremost, it shows the desperation of people from countries that are suffering significant economic downturn, that are suffering the lack of success that we have driven in battling an unprecedented in our lifetimes public health pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the many variants of it that have suffered by reason of violence and public corruption. That is a very significant driver, as is climate change, as is pent-up a demand for migration. There are, by reason of the factors I have outlined, the reopening of an asylum system, quite frankly, the return to a commitment to our humanitarian laws, which are laws that Congress passed, that we are obligated to enforce and uphold. There are a variety of reasons that explain the increase in numbers.
Right. But what do you think the U.S. response should be to those increased numbers?
So it is a multi-factor, multi-pronged response. We are investing in the root causes of irregular migration. That is not a short-term fix. That is a long-term fix for an enduring solution. We are continuing tirelessly to urge Congress to pass immigration reform that everyone agrees is needed. We are building the safe, orderly, and humane pathways that I spoke of a moment ago. We are making other reforms. We are instituting other reforms as we build rebuild an asylum system that was dismantled. We have the dedicated docket, dedicated immigration courts to claims of asylum made along the southern border. We are promulgating an asylum rule to contract the time between the time an individual is encountered at the border and their ultimate claim for asylum is adjudicated. And to your point, we are employing our law enforcement tools to address illegal immigration. We are removing individuals who do not qualify for relief under the law. We are using expedited removal wherever it is appropriate. We are removing people into the interior of Mexico or, of course, to their countries of origin as the law provides. We are deploying law enforcement operations to tackle the smugglers, to tackle those who facilitate smuggling. We have a multi-pronged approach that uses our humanitarian capabilities to enforce our humanitarian laws and to use our law enforcement tools to address those who seek to circumvent the law.
There's also a public health tool that from the Trump administration is still in place. And of course, that's Title 42. But given the fact that the U.S. is back to business this week at the borders, does Title 42 still make sense, keeping that in place?
So Title 42, as you mentioned, is a public health law. It is not an immigration law. It is a law that is held under the authorities of the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. Navigating, if I may, Annmarie, navigating through lawful migration at the ports of entry is a very, very different phenomenon than tackling the challenge of irregular migration in between the ports of entry. At the ports of entry, it is an example of safe and orderly movement of people with the license to come into the United States. In between the ports of entry, upon encounter, we, under the law and given our capacity constraints, take those individuals to a Border Patrol station. And a Border Patrol station is a congregant setting where people are jammed together in close quarters. That is not what we want in a time of a pandemic. For the protection of the American public, there is an opportunity for an individual with COVID to spread that virus to others. That is not what we want for the American public. That is not what we want for our frontline personnel, and that is not what we want for the migrant population itself. So the Border Patrol station and the apprehensions in between the ports of entry is very, very different than the phenomenon of lawful trade, lawful traffic through a port of entry.
Right, but under Title 42, if a migrant is trying to seek asylum, they could be turned away. Do you think Title 42 at some point will be lifted?
It is our hope that Title 42 is lifted, because that will communicate that, in fact, we have tackled this pandemic and the public health authority, the public health imperative is no longer needed.
Also with Title 42, there's a lot of repeat crossings. How is your department dealing with that?
So indeed, because what happens under Title 42 is that an individual is not able to make a claim of asylum. They are not removed. They are not placed in immigration enforcement proceedings, go before a judge, and are ultimately removed, but rather they are expelled under that public health authority. It is a far more rapid, accelerated process. Because of that, some migrants who have been expelled think that they can try again. And so we did, in fact, historically, over many months, see a high level of recidivism. And to your question earlier, we have used our tools to cut down on that recidivism significantly. No longer do we expel people on the other side of the border, but rather we expel them further into the interior of Mexico as one example, where it is far more difficult to repeat the offense.
But there are some repeat offenses. So is that why some of the border crossing numbers are so high? Because the past 8 months, they've been at records.
So, Annmarie, the numbers do not reflect, the numbers that are published do not reflect the number of different individuals whom we encounter at the border, but rather reflect the number of encounters. Mm-hmm. And that does include individuals who have repeatedly been encountered at the border and expelled.
When we're talking about migrants at the border, the president this Saturday remarked about the entitlement to families who devastatingly lost their children at the border. And this could potentially be monetary value. Now, I know this is going to go through the Department of Justice, but are you aware of these conversations and consulted about potentially this policy?
Well, I'm certainly aware of them. I have not been consulted. That is in the province of the Department of Justice. Those cases are quite distinct from the work that we in the Department of Homeland Security are doing to address the cruel and inhumane family separation policy of the past administration. At the Department of Justice, they are, in those cases, those are cases brought under the Federal Tort Claims Act. I am chairing the Family Reunification Task Force. And what we are doing is working on reuniting the families that were separated, either in the country of origin or here in the United States, depending on the facts and quite frankly, the needs and wants of the separated families. We are focused on reunification and providing wraparound services to try to restore those families. The suffering that those families endured has been extraordinary, tragic, and I have learned from my discussions with the reunited families how devastating that separation was.
Do you think that that's the correct policy, though, these compensation potentially?
I'm going to defer to the Department of Justice. I don't want to really speak to the cases for which they are responsible and the litigation that they are leading on behalf of the United States.
I had a feeling, as a good lawyer, you were going to say that. You also mentioned, when it comes to these conversations, of course, immigration reform always comes up. And right now, Democrats on Capitol Hill are potentially going to put in not full path to immigration, but a parole for a longer work visa for some immigrants, including some dreamers. Is this something you think is moving in the right direction? Do you support this?
Well, I certainly support immigration reform. You know, there's not very much right now that is being met with unanimity in the United States or in Congress specifically. And there is unanimity about the need to achieve immigration reform, that we are dealing with a broken immigration system. We remain hopeful that legislation will pass. We remain very committed to achieving it.
What do you think of this specific potential provision in reconciliation? Not a pathway to citizenship, but parole.
I think it is a step in the right direction. Our ambitions are far greater. Whatever progress we can make, we support, but our ambitions are broader.
As you say, this is something that does have a wide support, but actually getting to it, there's a lot of competing visions. What would your advice be to Congress?
I think that Congress has an opportunity to pass transformative change. I have spoken with members of the House. I have spoken with senators on both sides of the aisle about our broken immigration system. I did that from late 2009 through the end of 2016. I've done that since I assumed the office of the Secretary of Homeland Security. And I've been met with support. It's now just a matter of getting it done.
And you say this is a step in the right direction. What for you would be transformational?
I think the path to citizenship that bipartisan group agreed to many years ago. I think the opportunities are endless. We not only have the dreamers that have galvanized the hearts and minds of so many Americans, regardless of party. We have the farm workers who, but for whom we would not have the food on our table. We have individuals here under temporary protected status who, with lawful presence, have contributed so much to our communities. We have so much reform that is needed. We have so many people who have lived in the shadows for too long, who have given so much to our communities, who have served in our military, who've been first responders, who've been healthcare workers. There are fellow parishioners, teachers. It's extraordinary. There are neighbors, our friends, our classmates. The opportunities before us are so profound. I hope we meet that opportunity in a way that serves the best interests of our country, and we pass the reform that is as ambitious as the president outlined on his very first day in office.
Mm-hmm. I remember that. And right now, the Democratic Party holds the White House, the House, and the Senate. Do you think this is a moment that what you would envision could actually be done?
The president hasn't, by any means, given up on bipartisanship. I think his distinguished career speaks to his commitment to that key of American success.
Before we end, I wanted to ask something that's very, very Bloomberg, and it has to do with supply chains. The president tomorrow, as am I, I'm going to be at the Port of Baltimore, and this has been a huge issue. And the Department of Homeland Security, many people might not know, but you're involved at like that end level of the supply chain, checking what comes into the country, but also you have a mandate to ensure that the U.S. has all the critical supplies it needs. Can you tell us how, from where you sit, you have envisioned this whole supply chain and backlogs we've seen in the United States?
So a couple different lines of work arise from your question or are responsive to it. Of course, we've heard in the news a great deal about the supply chain challenges, and I'll leave it to others in the administration to speak about the cause of that, whether it's the increased demand for imported goods, whether it's shortages of equipment at our ports or labor shortages and the like. But what we do at the ports of entry is we facilitate the movement of goods and ensure the security of the goods that we are bringing into the United States. And once again, that's a number of different parts of the Department of Homeland Security play a pivotal role. Customs and Border Protection, the United States Coast Guard, to name just two. But we're very focused on staffing the ports of entry, increasing our operational hours to address the supply chain challenges and to bring whatever relief and support we can to tackling that.
Well, that was going to be my next question. If the president has this mandate and executive order, and he's working with the ports in Los Angeles to extend the time, how does that directly affect your operation? Are you hiring more? Are people getting overtime?
So all of the above. And in fact, when we talk about increased hours, very often we're talking about our increased hours. So yes, we have the Office of Field Operations in CBP, very focused on their staffing models and what we can do for our workforce that through just pure dedication to mission is willing to work extraordinary hours to meet the moment.
And Secretary Mayorkas, I just want to end with the arc of the Department of Homeland Security started out of 20 years on. Of course, this started from the tragedy that was 9/11. Now the department has some 240,000 employees. But there is these moments where it ends up at the bottom of the federal workplace rankings. I know you're probably sad to hear that. And you have pledged morale to boost it when you came into this new leadership role. Do you think the department over the 20 years since its inception has lost any of its focus?
No, not at all. And not one bit. The focus of our personnel is laser-like and unrelenting in dedication to mission. And yes, this department has suffered historically challenges with employee morale. The work we do is at the epicenter of the country's divide. The work is extraordinarily challenging. I am not focused exclusively on the short term. I'm focused on enduring solutions and delivering for the workforce, the department they deserve. Not only do we have 250,000 people in the Department of Homeland Security, we have about 56,000 veterans who continue their service to country through the Department of Homeland Security. And we're going to recognize those veterans and reflect on their service this Thursday on Veterans Day.
And if I can just quickly end with one question to you personally. This is such a cumbersome department. You mentioned the Coast Guard, cyber, immigration. All of this you are leading during the pandemic. How hard has that been?
Quite frankly, the work is really hard. And there's one foundation of inspiration, the people with whom I work.
Secretary Mayorkas, a very candid answer. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you, of course, to the 9/11 Museum and Memorial for having us both.
Thank you so much, Annmarie.